And that's kind of just one among a number of challenges. There's a lot of things that sandy courses, as I've talked about, really have going for them. But it's not without its challenges. This is the fifth green at Royal Portrush, and one of the major challenges that courses built on sand face is that because they're such a product of their environment, they're particularly sensitive to changes in that environment. And issues like coastal erosion and invasive vegetation and even stability and just kind of the long-term change of a landscape from a kind of dynamic dune landscape to a very stable, maintained golf landscape are all things that kind of pose a threat in a certain respect to the original characteristics that made the courses great. And to preserve that relationship between golf and the sandy ground that kind of gave birth to it requires pretty thoughtful design and a lot of careful maintenance. This is an image that is not unfamiliar to people here. This is Royal County Down, but facing a similar situation that you guys deal with on a regular basis, which is the expansion of the winds as the golf course is more stable and more mature. Shrubbery and then eventually trees gain more and more of a foothold. And as shrubs like gorse gain ground, they actually change the fundamental nature of the soil and fix more nitrogen into the soil and make for a richer soil. And so at Royal County Down, they're basically fighting kind of a constant battle against the stability of their landscape. Because if you looked at photos from 1930, 1940, all this would just be kind of wispy grass and blowing sand with little patches of shrubbery. But just the fact of having the golf course there slows the landscape down enough that these things begin to take over. And so as they keep trying to hack these back, what they discover is that even if you remove a pot of gorse, what's left behind is fundamentally changed. And they even need to go and strip the top layer off before they can expect to get a nice, lean, kind of rough, before they can expect to get something like heather to grow there, because that first layer of the soil has become so enriched by having the gorse on top of it. The same issue faces places like Royal Dornoch, and certainly there are more dramatic issues like coastal erosion, which you guys may deal with on parts of the course. And both of them are challenging. I almost think that stability is more dangerous in a certain respect because it's something that kind of changes courses over time without anyone really noticing. People notice when a hole is about to erode over the sea, like the fifth at Royal Portrush, and they're taking steps to try to deal with it. A lot of the times people just kind of wake up after 30 years and realize, boy, this is a different golf course now, and there's trees everywhere, and there didn't used to be. We talked about Walton Heath, and many of the Surrey courses around London, sandy courses that started off as open, wide open kind of wastelands of heather that somehow became forests by the time it was 1980, and people turned around and realized that the golf course is totally different. And not only are the rough areas different, but now the turf areas are different because air movement's changed, because the fertility of the ground has changed, because moisture has changed. Now all of a sudden the soil itself is richer everywhere. The grass is spongier. You're starting to lose that firm bounce to the ground. And so there's a lot, even though the gifts that kind of came to sandy courses were original with nature, there's a lot that goes into maintaining them in terms of top dressing, in terms of removing vegetation, in terms of all these different things to try to replicate that active landscape that made the courses great in the first place. And that's part of kind of designing and maintaining with nature. And I think that that's something that Scottish courses have always kind of had a handle on, and is something that American courses are probably waking up to ever so slowly. This is the 18th green at Bandon Dunes, at Pacific Dunes, at the Bandon Dunes Resort. And it's a great example of a course where they've managed to preserve a lot of the moving sand that was natural in the environment. There's dynamic dunes that are part of the play and part of the strategy of the course, but they're also a part of the health of the landscape. And while you certainly see some gorse creeping in there, it's managing that as part of the program, and they recognize the issue that comes with that increasing vegetation. So, golf is a product of dynamic, sandy landscapes, and to keep that relationship intact does a couple of things. It makes for better golf, and it also makes for a healthier and more ecologically valuable landscape. And the great thing is when you're dealing with golf on sandy ground, you have the opportunity to actually kind of manage for the better of both, for golf and the environment, which is something that's really difficult elsewhere because golf just belongs on sandy ground because the features of the game belong in that landscape. When you try to install a golf course into a place where there is heavy soil, where there is no sand, you basically fight a battle for the entire life of that course against the natural characteristics of that land. Certainly a soft, clay soil in a forested landscape is never going to support a golf course in the same way that your links will. And the process of trying to do so is going to involve chemicals, and it's going to involve money, and it's going to involve water, and it's going to involve all of these things in order to try to make something work where it doesn't want to. Sandy landscapes offer a different opportunity. And I think that's why a lot of the best courses we've seen developed in modern times have been on sandy ground. One, because it offers better opportunities for golf. But two, because the case can be made that in trying to get the permission to even do such a project, that you're not going to degrade the landscape in the process of creating this golf development, and in fact the opportunity exists to make it better. This is Cypress Point Club. We're all familiar with kind of the more dramatic oceanfront holes in the par 3s. They also have some really dramatic dunes land, and all of these dunes areas were once covered over entirely with an invasive vine species known as ice plant and a number of shrubs, non-native shrubs that came along with it. Over time, the course has gone through, from their part, really for a playability concern, to create more open areas, more interesting shots, and more areas where you can find your ball. But they were able to do it in a way that restored the dunes back to their kind of original ecological state. They were able to replant native species as opposed to the invasive ones that had taken over. And the end product is a healthier landscape and a more interesting landscape for golf, and one that's certainly not possible away from sandy ground. You would not be able to create sort of sandscapes like that or any equivalent hazard away from sandy ground. And you see what a beautiful job it does of kind of blending that course into the landscape, and you see how the bunkering just goes right into the dunes, and it creates a really great effect and a really positive ecological benefit. In a more modern example, this is Sabonic Golf Club on Long Island. Of course, I was lucky enough to work at Tom Doak and Jack Nicholas co-design. And the property originally was owned by an electrical workers trade union and was a bunch of baseball fields and cabins and various other things, and was really a very degraded dune landscape. Almost no attention had been paid to the environment during the life of its use as a recreational resort in that respect. There were invasive vines that had basically taken over all the forested areas. There was almost no native dune vegetation anymore. And part of getting the planning permission to do the project was that these dune areas would have to be restored, and this would have to be an ecological benefit to the area, and something that was going to be better than having it as a union retreat or worse still as a housing development. And you're talking about, unquantifiable amount of value as a housing development. In terms of just hundreds of millions of dollars. But the town didn't want that. Town of Southampton was trying to keep a nice kind of pristine landscape where possible and wanted to see this as an opportunity to restore something that had been lost. And you can see that the end result, we restored all of these dune areas, replanted native vegetation, and were able to incorporate them into the design so that not only did we get the ecological benefit, but you get the great effect of having the course just kind of blend into this coastal landscape. And at the same time, you get these really interesting hazards, really interesting places to play golf that are kind of an offshoot of the ecological restoration. Probably a more dramatic example of what's possible in terms of ecological restoration and sandy ground is the Streamsong Golf Resort. This is in Central Florida. This is the site of a former phosphate mine, and the way that the mining operation worked over thousands of acres, is that the top 3 or 4 feet of soil, pure sand, were of no use to them. What they wanted was the phosphate-rich rock below. And so they would skim off on a totally flat 1,000-acre site. They'd skim off the sand and throw it into piles and dig up the rock. And what they had left were piles of sand kind of randomly scattered around in a way that ended up looking quite a bit like a dune landscape. And so when the mining company came time to, they're obliged to restore the landscape in some respect after their process is over. And they decided, rather than just kind of smooth the thing out and grass it out, which is what the minimum obligation they have, they decided to try to do something interesting. And they brought a few architects in, and Tom Doak and Corin Crenshaw were the ones they selected. And what both told the company was, what you guys have here is basically an accidental great landscape for golf with pure sand in an otherwise flat landscape. So you've got something interesting and something unique that basically doesn't exist in flat central Florida. Why don't we try to do something different? And so you can hardly, you take a look at it, it just looks like it's been there forever. Just a perfect dune landscape for golf. There was actually an entirely kind of restored environmental effort. Probably an even more dramatic example and a more clear-cut example, because you can really see that the dunes around that green are just mining piles just thrown there by a drag line, and they were able to find a nice green site kind of tucked in amongst them for a par 3. You play golf there now, and rather than looking like some kind of a despoiled landscape, it feels like you're walking through a nature sanctuary. There's life everywhere, there's great golf, there's really firm ground, and it really is a perfect example of kind of what's possible. And the mining company's delighted, and they're making money off of the land in a way that they never would have just having turfed it over and forgotten about it and moved on to the next mining project. And so it's really been kind of a win-win-win, and it shows, again, what's possible on sandy ground that just really isn't elsewhere. So thank you very much. There's your 14th at Royal Dornoch, taken the day I saw George here in 2008, very quickly. And fantastic hole and a fantastic course, and it was great to be here talking to you guys, and great to see you all again.